The crisis of the 3rd century. Years of natural disasters and warfare had decreased the empire's population and damaged its economy. New and powerful enemies had increased the need for larger armies and stronger fortifications, which required higher taxations from the provinces. Life for many Romans in this period became much more dangerous and unpredictable, and the government became even more inefficient and burdensome. Some Romans had taken matters into their own hands by revolting against the central authority, which added even more difficulties for the emperors. In order to survive the crisis, the Romans were forced to make several changes to their policies and organization, and by the time of Diocletian, the emperor had set the stage that had changed the face of the imperial government for the next 1,000 years. What did the Romans do to survive the crisis, and what changes did Diocletian make that were so profound in Roman history? There are many ancient Roman authors who gave their inputs into this question. Many Roman historians had given a synopsis of Rome's past before writing about their own time. Their inputs are useful in telling us about the noteworthy events that had occurred, but they're insufficient in helping us create an objective analysis of the empire. Such things would require analytical information like statistics, data, and documents, which are rare in the ancient world. Fortunately, the Romans were avid record keepers that created many tax records, itineraries, contracts, and pay stubs, but only a few of them survived to the modern day. One very important find was the Notitia Dignitatum, which contained documents of dignitaries, troops dispositions, and even the design of the unit seals for the years around 400 AD. Other documents like codices, edicts, and letters can also give clues as to what happened in the past by what the people who made these documents were reacting to. Using the available information from both ancient and modern sources, this video will go over the size of the Roman forces, the strategies that had been employed by the Romans, how both the army and government had changed through the 3rd century crisis, and then the changes that has been made by Diocletian. During the time of Rome's first emperor, Augustus Caesar, the empire had a standing army of 28 legions with a theoretical strength of around 150,000 men, supported by numerous auxiliary regiments reported to contain an equal number of men, for a total of approximately 300,000 soldiers. Rome also had a navy with a strength of around 15 to 20,000 men. This number didn't change much during the early Principate, for the Romans had completely dominated the Mediterranean Sea, so piracy was practically unheard of. There was also 10,000 soldiers for the garrison of Rome, but these troops have little relevance in the field, so they would be separate from the total. Augustus Caesar had ended his reign with 25 legions, for when 3 legions were lost in Germania, he did not replace them, probably because he thought the size of the army was already too burdensome. By the reign of Emperor Trajan, the empire had 30 legions with a larger number of auxiliary regiments, which brought the total number of troops to an estimated 380,000 men. Then, in the mid-2nd century, the Roman Empire was hit by a plague, and the legions were more frequently engaged in conflicts around the empire. This resulted in the legions having less men than their appointed strength, so by the reign of Septimus Severus, even though the number of legions had been increased to 33, it's likely that the total number of soldiers in the Roman army may actually be lower than in the times of Trajan. These large number of soldiers had been a considerable expense for the empire. Already in the 2nd century, Marcus Aurelius had tried to auction off his own belongings to pay for the upkeep. But most other emperors rather confiscate estates from the nobles through contrived treason trials for extra income. Even before the crisis of the 3rd century, Roman emperors had already decreased the parity of the silver coins from 75 to even 50% of the coin, in order to increase the number of coins, which inevitably decreased the value of the currency. However, the Romans had to defend thousands of miles of territory from multiple opponents, so the emperors had to consistently maintain a force big enough to deal with the prevailing threats of the day. But during the height of the crisis, the legions had suffered heavy casualties, and the provinces that had paid for the upkeep were severely damaged. As a result, the Roman Empire was suffering both from a lack of manpower and the inability to pay for them. The percentage of silver on the coins had decreased to 5%, and during times of repeated scarcity, the price of goods had increased to a point where they became completely unaffordable. This prompted the government to pay its soldiers in kind, called the annona. Originally, when a soldier is supplied with weapons, clothing, and food, it will be deducted from his pay. But during the height of the crisis, additional rations and clothing were sometimes used as a substitute for money. Sometimes the soldiers were forced to requisition these supplies from the local towns and villages they were stationed in, with the government trying to keep track of these requisitions to give tax exemptions to people whom the soldiers took the supplies from. Unfortunately, this form of taxation had often been abused, as it had been collected haphazardly based on the immediate needs of the army. Nevertheless, the annona had been an indispensable compensation in times of crisis when coinage was inadequate. The 3rd century crisis had also forced the Romans to reevaluate their strategy by redesigning their defenses and reorganizing their armies. Before the crisis, the Romans had kept most of their forces close to the borders, with watchtowers, signal towers, and a couple of legionary and auxiliary forts spread across them. A typical Roman fort would often be spacious enough to fit a whole legion. The walls were thin, as the ramparts were usually only wide enough to serve as walkways for sentries, with multiple observation posts lined across them. The strategy was to intercept the threats before they came into the provinces. Light cavalry and auxiliary forces would either intercept low-level threats or delay a larger threat until the slower-moving legions catch up to make battle. But events had proven this strategy had been insufficient to defend the empire. Therefore, during the 3rd century, the Romans changed the design of their defenses to smaller, more numerous forts. The cities that were previously exposed to the ravages of the barbarians had been fortified all over the empire. The walls had become taller and thicker, while the observation posts had been replaced with towers that protrude out of the walls, with battlements placed on top of them, so the archers and artillery could launch projectiles against anyone who tried to scale the walls. The idea is to have a defense in depth where the invaders would have to tackle each strong point before moving forward, or else they would have their lines attacked from behind if they avoided them. The infantry that normally built encampments at the end of each day's march and carried rations on their backs would instead be supplied and protected by depots that were strategically placed along the roads, so they would be able to travel much faster than they had before. The legions seem to have been too unwieldy to respond to the multiple threats facing the empire, so the Romans extracted several units from the legions and mixed them together with other units in order to create temporary combat groups called vexillations, and over time, many of these temporary units became permanent. This allowed emperors like Gallienus to create mobile cavalry divisions to quickly respond to the threats facing the empire. These cavalry units were more expensive and more difficult to replace than the infantry, but they were also more mobile and brought in extra capabilities for the armies. By the 4th century, the armies had been separated into 2 different kinds of units. The first kind are the mobile troops called the comitatenses. These are the professional full-time soldiers that are expected to be the main force to engage the enemy on the battlefield. Among them are some of the best troops of the Roman armies, like the Palatini, which are considered to be the elites. These units are usually placed further behind the lines in order to engage enemy breakthroughs or assemble for an invasion into enemy territory. The other kind of units are the limitanae, which are the static troops used to guard the fortifications around the empire. Since most of these troops were placed in fortified areas, they did not need to be as well trained or equipped as the comitatenses. So many of them were part-time soldiers who spent most of their time working in other jobs like farming or crafting. The quality of these troops can vary widely. Some of them may have neglected their training and were merely farmers who only picked up their weapons during emergencies, while others would have been regularly trained and utilized for raids or battles. As the crisis of the 3rd century had demonstrated that the Roman armies were unable to effectively defend all the borders of the empire, this new strategy had been implemented in order to have a powerful reserve ready to respond to the enemy, while the locals would have the means to survive foreign invasions long enough for the main armies to deal with them. The new circumstances had also forced change upon the Roman administration. The Roman bureaucracy had been constantly expanding, while the men from the senatorial class had gradually lost their positions within the government and the military to men from the lower ranks. Before Rome received its first emperor, its most powerful people resided in the Senate. But after numerous civil wars, the senators had lost much of their powers to the Emperor Augustus Caesar. As a compromise between them, the ownership of the provinces had been split between the emperor and the Senate. The senatorial provinces were governed by men that were selected by the Senate, while the imperial provinces were governed by legates which acted as representatives of the emperors. Some of the highest positions of the administration were reserved exclusively to the senators, and senators had also commanded legions. It was also customary for a newly made emperor to have his powers ratified by the Senate, even though it's more of a gesture than a real transfer of power. He would converse with them like equals, and his dress wouldn't be too extravagant. Even though in practice the emperor's authority overpowers the Senate, many other emperors like Trajan and Marcus Aurelius had at least played along with the Senate's sensibilities. The Roman elite were adverse to monarchs who behaved differently from the normal ethical values of their people. Very often, the Romans would contrast the free Romans to the despots in the East with their harems and their extravagant displays of wealth, so the writers were very critical of Roman emperors who behaved in the same manner. This is why when Augustus Caesar made himself emperor, his official title was Princeps Civitatis, or First Citizen. Augustus had also created a new kind of administration that hasn't existed during Republican times, by creating new offices made for specific tasks like a surveyor of the public buildings, manager of the aqueducts, and prefects for the grain supplies. Over time, more of these offices were being created under different emperors, which were increasingly being filled by a class of men called equestrians. The equestrians are a property-based class that is ranked below the senators. But unlike the senators, the equestrian rank could be obtained through property qualifications and not by birth. This means that any Roman citizen with enough resources could become an equestrian, many of which had started their career in the military. By the 3rd century, Roman citizenship had spread across the provinces, and many soldiers from low social origins had managed to occupy high positions in the empire. So by the time of Emperor Gallienus, the equestrians began to fill in positions that were originally reserved for the senatorial class. The Senate had also lost ownership of many of their provinces to the imperial government, so by the time of Diocletian, the only known provinces that are still owned by the Senate were Asia and Africa, and they are much smaller than their former size. This transition had even extended to the military, where by the end of the 3rd century, virtually none of the military high command were occupied by senators. These changes had a very profound effect on the entire empire, as large numbers of competent and ambitious careerists had taken over the ranks from people who once claimed these positions as their birthright. Aside from the empire's administrative apparatus, down to the municipal level, the cities were managed by the city magistrates called the decurions. These decurions were chosen in yearly elections from a group of the city's wealthiest people called the curiales. The decurions were responsible for a wide variety of roles directly relating to the well-being of the city, including the funding of public buildings like baths, temples, and theaters, as well as public activities like games and festivals, all of which are paid for out of their own pockets. These wealthy men were useful in keeping the public order, and many of them had volunteered to this position to increase their prestige. However, their most important function to the state was the collection of taxes for the empire, and if they did not collect enough taxes, they would have to make up for the shortfall from their own assets. This kind of arrangement between the imperial government and the local elites seems to have continued even after the crisis. Then comes Diocletian, the prolific organizer. The man had surveyed the entire empire and addressed the various inefficiencies and shortcomings. Everything from the army, the administration, and even the culture surrounding the emperors had been changed. These changes he made to the empire were so profound that historians had separated the different areas of imperial Rome from the Principate to the Dominate. One of his plans involved a significant increase in the number of soldiers and administrators. This led contemporary writers like Lactantius to claim that Diocletian had multiplied the number of bureaucrats and soldiers. No doubt an exaggeration, but a reflection of Diocletian's action of the time. Modern historians are not entirely sure how much Diocletian had increased the size of the forces, but according to a 6th century Roman administrator named John Litus, The Romans had 389,704 men for the army and 45,562 for the navy at some point during Diocletian's reign, and this number had increased during the time of Constantine. Another number was given by a historian named Agathias, who wrote a couple of years after John, said the Roman army had once contained 645,000 men. This number is far too excessive, but his observation may have been based on real military documents with the assumption that all units were at full strength, which is unlikely. According to the Notitia Dignitatum, the Roman Empire had at least 63 legions, over 100 vexillations, and dozens of other dedicated infantry and cavalry units. Overall, most estimates put the size of the Roman army to somewhere around 500,000 men. The estimated population of the Roman Empire from the 1st to 4th century is usually between 40 to 60 million inhabitants, which means the Roman army is usually around 1% of the whole population. As for the administration, during the height of the crisis, the governors whose job was to judge disputes, enforce the laws, and command armies would often neglect some of their duties to focus on more pressing needs on the fronts. In order to lighten the workload for each governor, Diocletian had split the number of provinces into a larger number of smaller provinces, which subsequently increased the number of governors to govern them. The governors would also lose their military function, which had been given to the local military commanders called dukes, whose jurisdiction could span over multiple provinces. The empire would also be separated into 12 different dioceses, each of them being under the authority of vicars. These vicars were responsible for the supplies and payments for the troops, the raising of taxes, and jurisdiction over the cities, and they answered directly to the empire's praetorian prefect. Not all of these changes were completed under Diocletian's reign, but near the end of his reign, only a few governors were left with military command. This large influx of administrators also needed instructions on how to properly implement Roman law, so it can be applied consistently throughout the provinces. Everything from the rights of a citizen to their property, contracts, and punishment of crimes, the Romans looked towards the law as a guidance on how to maintain a stable and just society. Throughout the centuries, Romans from all walks of life sent petitions and requests for legal advice to the imperial government, and the emperors and jurists had responded to them through many rescripts and interpretations. But during the crisis, many legal requests had been neglected as the Roman emperors were distracted by the matters of war, and the institutions required for the upkeep of jurists had foundered. When order became restored, Diocletian needed a guidebook for the new wave of administrators set to govern the empire. Therefore, in the year 291, Diocletian had commissioned professional jurists named Gregorius to collect a whole list of enactments made by the emperors, and in the year 293, Diocletian hired another jurist named Hermogenian to review the many rescripts so he can update and clarify them. This resulted in the creation of the Codex Gregorianus and the Codex Hermogenianus, which were to serve as reference points for many governors of the provinces to know how to properly instruct and execute the law. The emperors would also be surrounded by a large court of officials and advisors called a consistory. From the finance ministers to the legal advisors and secretaries, the consistory had assisted the emperors in managing the many mechanisms of administration by keeping track of the empire's finances and answering the waves of petitions that are sent to the emperor. As for the designated guardians of the emperors, the role of the Praetorian Guard had been relegated to a mere guards for the city of Rome. In their original place, Diocletian had created two new military units, the Jovian Legion to guard himself and the Herculean Legion to guard his fellow Augusti Maximium. The head of the Praetorian Guards, the Praetorian Prefect, had taken on more of an administrative role. They were able to handle judicial cases, manage taxations, and answer petitions. They also held military command under Diocletian, but this function seems to have been removed after Constantine. The consistory and the guards would accompany the emperors wherever they went, and the emperor's presence would be known to the locals by the large supply trains that followed them. The emperors themselves would no longer walk among their subjects like other men. Instead, they would preside over them like godlike monarchs. Large elaborate ceremonies would be performed before the emperors would impart their presence to their subjects. Their clothes would be covered in jewelry, from their headgear to their shoes, and their headquarters would be in palaces. In many ways, the presentation of the emperors became very similar to the Persian king of kings, with their extravagant clothes and jewel-encrusted beards. Diocletian and Maximian had also claimed descendants from the gods. Diocletian a descendant of Jove, and Maximian of Hercules. Of course, most Romans didn't really believe they were physical descendants, but spiritual descendants, a second rebirth, so to speak. It is from this form of relationship that both Maximian and Diocletian became brothers in the eyes of the Romans. It was assumed that this change in presentation was the result of a humble soldier when in control of a vast amount of wealth, craved splendor and adulation, but in reality, this change may have been born out of necessity. Diocletian was not the first emperor to claim his powers derived from the gods. Emperor Aurelian had claimed patronage from the god Sol Invictus, and even before the 3rd century crisis, various Roman emperors had also claimed divinity. In a world where any charismatic leader with an army could potentially claim themselves to be emperor, the reigning emperors needed to seek legitimacy that didn't just come from the armies, so they looked towards the Almighty. This will make overthrowing the emperors a crime not only against the people of Rome, but also a crime against God and nature. However, claims of divinity alone proved to be insufficient to deter potential usurpers, as many of them had tested the emperor's divinity. In order to deter more future usurpers, Diocletian also needed to appear otherworldly to his fellow mortals. While the educated elites would understand the importance of preserving the name and tradition of a state that had long existed before their time, and defeated the great opponents of the past like the Greeks and Carthaginians, the ordinary citizens would have been more concerned with the affairs of their own lives and of God's temperament. The chaos of the 3rd century had shaken many in their beliefs of the old gods, as cities were sacked, shrines were destroyed, and the temples fell into disrepair. Many Romans did what they could to return God's favor, but for some reason they seem to have been forsaken. In order to curate the God's favor, Diocletian had revived the worship of the old gods of Rome and built new temples dedicated to them. These changes were not the result of a cynical manipulation of the masses. Diocletian, like many others, were wary of the motives of the powerful divine that had influenced the world with their mysterious ways. In search of how to retain their favor, his answers were found in stories and past traditions. The ordinary Romans need comfort in the idea that these powerful entities were on their side, proven not only by the presence of God's representative, but also by their tranquility and their victories against their enemies. However, enlarging the size of the armies, the bureaucracy, fortifying the cities, building temples, and maintaining 4 courts for 4 emperors came with a considerable costs that the Roman citizens had to bear. In order to pay for this upkeep, Diocletian had reformed the tax system and removed many of the ancient privileges that had existed for centuries before his time. The kind of taxes the Romans had to pay was the poll tax, the land tax, along with various custom tolls, sales tax, and other taxes based on manufacturing. However, taxation throughout the provinces had also varied considerably, because the Romans had usually taken over the tax systems that were in place when they conquered the territory. The Romans usually preferred to farm out the privilege of tax collection to people who would pay the required amount to the government on behalf of the area before collecting their own taxes based on local tradition. But with the instability of the currency, the Romans had to work in the annona and show a more workable tax system, in which both the money and supplies could be paid without the arbitrary requisitions which had been applied unevenly throughout the provinces. Therefore, Diocletian had standardized a system in which the vast lands of the empire was assessed and calculated so each province and city could give the appropriate amount of supplies to the armies on an equitable basis. Every couple of years, a census would be made on the lands, the people, animals, orchards, vineyards, and many other relevant things regarding the productivity of the lands. Many of the various taxes had been replaced by this one basic system based on 2 measurements, called a caput and a jugrum. The caput being the tax based on the people and their assets, while the jugrum is a tax based on the land. There are also different variations of what constitutes a full caput or jugrum. Typically, a caput stood for 1 man and whatever else was in his household, but sometimes poorer households could be grouped together to represent 1 caput, while a rich household could represent several, and there are also regional differences that could change what constitutes a caput, depending on the climate and culture of the area. The same can go for the Eugerim, with the people paying more for the best arable lands than the less arable ones. Italia, the homeland of the Romans and center of the empire, had long avoided many of the taxes that had pervaded all the other provinces. So had the wealthy city of Alexandria, the home of many aristocrats and scholars. Diocletian had revoked their ancient privileges, and the people reacted very unkindly to these changes. But by the beginning of the 4th century, they had joined in with the rest of the Romans in the same burdens. Diocletian had also made edicts to ensure that every tax requirement is publicly open for everyone to see, so every tax-paying citizen would know exactly what they and their neighbors had owed. This was done to prevent tax collectors from taking in more than what's legally required, and the appropriate channels had been made for tax-paying subjects to plead their case if they had been charged in an illegal manner. Despite this, some contemporary writers, like Lactantius, had described the actions of some tax collectors as brutal and exploitative. Although Lactantius was a Christian who spoke with a heavy bias against the pagan emperors, a pagan writer named Aurelius Victor had also mentioned that while the new taxes were initially endurable, later grew into a scourge. The once prestigious position of decurion became ruinous for many unfortunate magistrates who had fallen to that responsibility. The state, now wanting to spend more resources in paying for more salaried officials, had turned to these wealthy magnates to fulfill their civic duty. Many of them had used various means to escape this obligation, but the emperors too had taken measures to retain these tax collectors until any wealthy landowner could be forced to fulfill this role. There is also a matter of labor shortages and abandoned farmlands left from the crisis. The state did whatever it could to put everything back into working order, especially in the farms, which were the basis of the entire Roman economy. One of the things they've done was give tax exemptions for anyone who took over vacant land, but they had also used captured barbarians from the wars to fill them. Another thing they've done was giving empty lands to the cities and tax them based on that ownership, which forced the city councils to find tenants for the lands. As for the craftsmen, they had offered tax exemptions or generous payments to get people into the required trades. But where incentives had failed, they've also used compulsion to get what they needed. Guilds and corporations, which acted with some degree of independence during the early Principate, had also fallen into more stricter government control. The state had also tried to control the price of goods, but this seemed to be only temporary. Another development that has been made during the 3rd and 4th centuries was the increase in the number of villas throughout the empire. These villas allowed the rich landlords to move closer to their tenants, and the villas themselves can also provide mills, presses, as well as drought animals to the tenants. Normally, a landlord will lease out the lands to tenant farmers, otherwise known as colony, to cultivate the lands. But in times of insecurity and heavy taxation, arrangements had been made where the colony would tie themselves to the lands as long as the landlords would pay taxes on their behalf and represent them in legal matters. In some ways, these villas had operated like mini cities, and the landlords had fulfilled the roles that used to be the responsibility of a city magistrate. As long as the arrangements meets the needs of the state, the empire lets it operate as they were. When everything's put into working order, the state also needed to ensure that the supplies would reach the armies on a timely basis without interruption. There is also a matter of tax collection. The massive effort spent on cataloging all the people, land, and assets would have gone to waste if the area had been significantly changed after the census. Therefore, the emperors took measures to tie people to their professions. From the artisans to the city councilors, bakers, weavers, farmers, or any position that fulfills the needs of the state, were ordered by the state to stay in their positions, which were also made hereditary. If a colony had left the land to work in another area without finding a suitable replacement, he would be compelled by the laws to return to his land. Similarly, his landlord cannot unlawfully remove him from his land, and if he was forced to leave by some unfortunate circumstances, like wars or natural disasters, many years would be allocated to him to reclaim it, even if another tenant had taken it over. However, enforcement of these laws had often been ineffective, so in practice, some leeway had been involved. But the laws exemplifies the priorities of the state when it comes to its resources. By that point, many of the colony were effectively tied to the land anyways, so the laws had merely confirmed what was already common practice. Some modern historians had mistakenly attributed the status of a tenant farmer somewhat equal to a slave, which is inaccurate, but various measures had been made to improve the lives and conditions of slaves. as several emperors had made edicts to prevent their murder or unlawful mutilations. The use of slaves had decreased considerably compared to the 1st century, especially as the Romans during this time preferred to settle captured barbarians in unused lands as colonies rather than slaves, and the relative scarcity of manpower made the slaves grow more important to the state. However, when the freedoms of ordinary Romans had decreased and the rights of slaves had increased, it's understandable as to why some people would make such an assumption. Overall, the Roman Empire of the 4th century was vastly different from the 1st. The early Principate with its low taxation levels and lightly managed administration had been replaced by the new heavy bureaucratic machinery that's maintained by the burdensome taxation of its subjects. As a consequence, this new Roman administration was able to manage and interfere with the lives of their citizens much more than they ever had before. The strictness of this new system reflects the militaristic mind of the ruler, who treats society as a whole in the same manner as the army, where everyone had their assigned duties, and the Romans accepted it for the sake of their safety and stability. Not all of the changes were made by Diocletian alone, for it was a development that was made through many subsequent emperors, but he did create a system that changed how Roman society and the empire would be run. The changes they made ended up determining how the societies around the Mediterranean would operate, all the way to the medieval ages, even in territories where the Romans lost control.